Our conversations about confronting bias continue with the moderator for our next panel, Vice President of Global Communications and Advocacy for Procter & Gamble, Damon Jones.
Good morning, ADCOLOR family. Good morning. How we feeling? All right, great. We are excited about this next conversation, a conversation about men, men of color, black men, how we are portrayed in the media, because we know the power of images, the powers of stories, and we know that all too often black men are not portrayed positively and accurately in many different types of media, be that news, be that media, film or entertainment. And so what we wanted to do was to talk about some of that bias that exists in the industries of which we all participate, but more importantly, get some perspective from a great panel that we've assembled here today to understand what are some of the insights behind those decisions, and importantly, how can we as creatives, strategists, and storytellers impact that narrative. So with that, let me do a quick tour the stage, if you will. Emil Wilbekin probably needs no introduction, but many of you may know him from his long standing at Vibe as being a pioneer there. Currently, he's the Chief Content Officer at Afropunk, and also has created Native Son, which we'll talk about, really changing the narrative about how men of the LGBTQ spectrum are being portrayed in media. So, Emil, welcome.
Thank you.
DeRay Mckesson has been out there representing those who have not always had a voice from a social justice perspective. DeRay, thank you for all your activism, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
To my right, Anthony Mandler. Anthony has been behind the scenes in many powerful images across photography, across film, across advertising, across many different industries, music, sports. So we'll talk about that. Anthony, thank you.
Thank you
for being here. And Karrelle Dixon, another longtime advertising executive, currently the managing director at Wieden+Kennedy in Portland. So Karrelle, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
So I guess why don't we start our discussion with, a broad question talking about the state of how black men are represented in the industries in which you guys see in film and television and advertising. What is inspiring you right now, and what is concerning to you and what you're seeing? Emil, kick us off.
I'm really excited right now because I feel like we're living in this time of real great intersectionality and identity. And people are really owning who they are and forcing advertisers and media and humanity to really be respectful of gender, of identity, of women, of trans, of disabilities. Like, everyone wants to be seen and heard as who they are. And it's exciting to see how media and advertising is having to react to that and having to really be honest about it and respect people and hear people and represent in a way that I think we've never really seen in our lifetimes.
Great, DeRay?
Yeah, I think that, as an organizer, we always remind people that the stories shape the lessons we learn. So the way we tell the story shapes the way people will take something away from it. And when I think about the stories that are being told about black men, I am excited that we are telling stories now that don't only center trauma. I think for so long, it was like every trauma is the only story that we can tell about black men. It is like a story of incarceration or poverty or addiction or something. All of those things are real things. That is not the only way that black people exist in the world. And I think about what did it mean? I grew up poor and we had a lot of joy. We were poor but not sad, And like, what does it mean to tell these stories where like, we had no toys outside, but we had a lot of love, right? And like, how do we tell stories that remind people of those things? We have seen a million stories of white people being lost at sea. And you're like, how many white people on boats do we need to see? It's like, so I am interested, in this moment, we are telling stories about things that are seemingly mundane, but that was like the lives that I grew up watching my great-grandmother on the porch with her friend, Miss Gertrude, I grew up with my father being a stock boy in a convenience store, and like those are the stories that I'm excited that are beyond trauma is the only frame.
Anthony, what are you excited about, or what are you concerned about in terms of the stories that are telling?
Big difference, right? I think what's exciting is not having to compromise the way we used to. Not having to, in a way, change the narrative of what is truthful and not in order to fit the corporate box. There's always been this sort of corporately molded version of inclusion, and really it was just a safe version. It wasn't the honest, true version. And I think what we've seen by sort of the social actions and the social change of rewriting our narrative is that corporate America essentially has to get in line quickly, because no one wants to be on the wrong side of that line and that story. And as somebody that always looks to go towards honesty and authenticity, and that means sort of telling the hard stories or telling the authentic stories, representing people in a true way, not in the commercialized way, the safe way. We're in a time where we can say things in rooms we never used to be able to say, because you would essentially take the conversation off the table, right? If you try to sell something too hard, because everybody wanted to be sort of safe and inclusive, which really is just a compromise for being sort of, safe, right?
It is?
Yeah.
Karrelle?
I think for me, the exciting thing is the voices in the room. Like, now we are in a point where individuals can really kind of, as Anthony said, express themselves in a way that allows them to kind of shape the narrative that they want. I think it's critical that we're now seeing more events and more things that are supporting us, whether it's Afropunk, whether it's Afrotech, whether it's ADCOLOR. Like, now all of a sudden there are far more platforms for us to be able to have the conversation, which I think in the past just didn't necessarily exist, or if it did, it was a very small cohort of individuals that basically did that conversation. So I think that's what I'm excited about. I think the challenge is just trying to make sure that we break the narrative that everyone's the same. I think it's like if you look at the media, and I'm from the UK, but you think of the media, you would think that every black man in America is either an actor or an athlete. Like, that's it. And you go, there are so many roles, it's so diverse. Why does it always become this kind of monolithic language about who the individual is, what do they look like, what do they do? So I'd love to see us kind of break that and see that expressed even more. And I think that did happen when you have Obama, but I think we need more of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting because that is a very similar insight to a film that we'll show in just a minute. Many of you may be familiar with a film that P&G produced a couple of years ago called The Talk. And The Talk was a story about conversations that black mothers often have with their children to prepare them for, the harsh realities that exist in the world. We took that back and got a lot of great feedback from that. But one of the stories that we knew that film didn't tell was the story of black men. And so we went off on a bit of a journey to do some research with our partners at BET to really dig deeper and uncover some insights about what were some of these stories that you guys have referred to. So we'll show the film in just a minute, but we partnered with a group called Saturday Morning Group. Saturday Morning is in the room, a group of black creative leaders to really go deeper. And so let's show the look. I want to get some reactions from our panelists to the film, but first, Anthony, you directed the masterpiece. Tell us, you got the brief from Saturday morning. How did you embark upon telling a story and telling that story authentically?
Well, nuance is the most important word, right? When you get a brief that's so powerful and specific and has the ability to impact you like the talk did, the responsibility is to do it with very delicate hands and make sure that what you're doing is not, overslung in either direction, that you're really hitting it in a way that people that are watching is saying, that happened to me, I know what that feels like, that happens to me every day. I watched my friend go through that, I watched my parent go through that. For me, it was, I had to make it relevant to my life, right? So for me, it was about my immigrant grandparents talking about what it was like when they first came to America. So I had to, in my head, say, what's the sensitivity that I can bring to this, to mirror this beautiful creative, to do it in a way where you're not, if you go too far, people will say, well, that's not totally accurate. But if you're subtle and there's nuance, then everybody from every side can sort of say, that feels accurate. And I think we all know this is something that happens daily for people and have for their whole lives and is a problem in America from coast to coast, right, and historically. And people say, oh, well, I'm not racist, I'm not that. But when you watch and you put a mirror on somebody, you see the way they look without even realizing it, like the mother who rolls up the window or the guest who comes in and just says, I'd rather sit over here. You can read that a lot of different ways, but in the context of what we're doing, that nuance is where the power is. And then it was sort of like you never know who you're looking at. In the research and crafting this, there was conversations about what his job should be in the end. And what we realized was, the youngest black judge in America is 26 years old. 26. And that was sort of it for us. It was like, let's go for that, because that feels like something powerful,
Story that needs to be told. What was your reaction to the film? Neither of you are shy.
No. I was, well, first of all, I loved it because it did really capture what I feel as I move through the world, especially as a black gay man. I feel like there's a lot of nuances to how people treat me when they walk down the street. When they see me, they see a black gay man, but it's old stereotypes, right? Like in the elevator and someone kind of pulls back and you're like, really? Like we're still doing that? And these things happen, like even at the airport, just coming to LA, it's like you feel this thing that still happens. So when I saw it, it was, I thought, provocative. I thought it was very bold for it to come from P&G, but I felt like it was right on time. I had no idea until I was asked to be on this panel that my friend Anthony Mandler directed it, and it's someone that I've worked with at Vibe most of my career, and doing covers and fashion shoots. So his sensibility also, now it makes even more sense to me, but it was beautiful. It was powerful. It made me feel whole.
Right, DeRay?
I think about, it's interesting to see these things on film because I think it did I think I was supposed to watch this before the panel, but I'm just seeing it for the first time, so this is here. I think it did two things for me. One is that it reminded me that I'm not alone in the experience. You're like, yes, that is real, that happens for other people. And I do think that there's something about the sense of loneliness that actually drives you mad because you feel like you're like, did that happen to me? And then you start second guessing yourself and you're like, she definitely rolled her window up because of me. So there's something about that. And I was in an airport in Chicago once, and you know how TSA, which has never stopped any terrorist attack, TSA had one of those hands, like randomized hand things. So I'm late for this flight and I'm running and I see this guy doing the random things and I'm like, you know what, if I get stopped, it's just God, whatever, not his fault, he's doing his job. So of course he stops me and I'm running and he goes, stop running. And I'm like, did you stop me because it's random or because I'm running? And he was like, you need to stop running. And I was like, oh, we're not doing this. And he was like, lower your voice, I'm gonna call the police. And I'm like, oh, call him. I'm like, call him, let's do it, call him. So I'm like, I'd have missed the flight already, we could do this all day. So I'm like a whole scene, but it was this moment of like, if I was a white man in a suit, it would have taken a lot more to get you to, I'm gonna call the police. But because I'm like a black, and I'm wearing a vest and a book bag, I look like I'm 19 at that moment, that day, And like, he was like, I'm gonna call the police, call them, let's do this. And of course, like no police officer came, but this was affirming in the sense that I think the loneliness is actually what makes people mad, like it drives you mad, and then you have to work on your response. So like, I couldn't yell at the guy even though I was like, call the police. I had to be calm, like, call them, you know, like that's how the second, when I wanted to call him everything but a child of God, it was, the second thing is I'd push and say like, a reminder that that this would have been as powerful too if he had been a mechanic or a salesman or a bartender or a teacher, right? This reminder that our worthiness is not tied into what we do, it is tied into the fact that we exist in the first place, right? And there is there's sort of a way that whiteness works, that whiteness suggests that for everybody but itself that you earn worthiness, right? And that what we remind people is that like you actually are already worthy, that the earning thing is a trick of white supremacy, that we are already deserving of everything right now.
Karrelle, you, like me, work in the advertising industry, right? And it's oftentimes we want to tell stories authentically, we want to tell them real, and we've also seen other people that don't get it right from time to time. Take us in the room, right? You get a brief, and this industry is not as diverse as it needs to be. How do we make sure that we can tell authentic stories even when we don't have all the lived experiences that might be represented in a film like this?
I mean, I think it's pretty simple. Like, you have to be intentional about who's in the room. Like, I think it's like, that isn't, that should be a non-negotiable. And I think we spend so much time apologizing for bringing someone into a room that is authentically, that does know the subject matter, that does know. And it's like, well, they're only 19. So what? They know. Like, that individual knows what we're talking about. So I feel like when you start to look at the makeup of an agency, you have to ask that question of who's in the room. I was fortunate, I ran the Nike team in Portland for a number of years. And for anyone that hasn't been to Portland and newscast, like one of the whitest places in America. I didn't tell my wife that when we were going there. But we get there, and so now we're in the room, and now we have to really think about Nike, and how does Nike show up as a global brand? Well, the first thing that I was doing is like, well, we have 8 offices around the world. I need the best person in every one of those offices to come to Portland. So that was my way of trying to change the culture, to influence the way that people think about it. I think you have to make sure that as you're having these conversations that you are confident in it. Like, there are times where you sit there and I'm like, oh, come on, I know you want to say it. Like, I can see like a younger African-American woman or African-American man or a Latinx man or woman, and you see the conversation, you're like, I can see you want to say something. And so for everyone that's in the room, that should be one of the things that you're looking for, is like actively not just listening with your ears, but listening with your eyes. Because who actually wants to speak? Because there are times where people are like, if I say this, like someone might judge me, I'm only young. Like, creating that environment where you are looking with your eyes as much as you're looking with or listening with your ears. Really
now, Anthony, you've done, I mean, obviously you've done film, you've directed commercials, you've directed music videos for Rihanna and Drake and all that. As you're putting together your teams and approaching this, how do you ensure that those voices not only are there, but how are you bringing those different perspectives to the stories that you're telling?
Well, I think, you know, whatever we're doing, it's a creative process. You know, when I get it and we sort of go through the business of it, and then we get our hands around it, you want to have the most creative people around you, right? So, for instance, on this, you know, I partnered with Malik Saeed as my cinematographer, who's somebody I've worked with for 20 years, and somebody who has an incredibly strong voice and a vision and has lived on every side of the line and really sort of, you know, is somebody that wants to raise his hand and give his opinion, which is what you want. I mean, I think that for me, I was thankful to be part of the team that made this, but this was made by a team, you know. The crew at Saturday Morning was inclusive, and they were, ultimately everything was about the creativity, right? And so we had a lot of time to sort of sit with it, and what if we did this way, what if we did that? When we shot it, we shot, you know, long days so we could make sure we had range. And I think anything in this day and age that's going to have an effect has got to be told from multiple sides of the story. We've spent too many years telling the story from a controlled perspective. And I say that controlled because, and anybody in the advertising world that sits in the room like we do knows what casting situations are like, how we sort of try to, as they would say, round the edges to everything so it's digestible and it's sort of easily watchable and sort of if we run this in the Midwest, they'll love it. If we run it in New York, they'll love it. And if we run it in the South, they'll love it. And how do you sort of do that? I think there was a formula where you sort of just boil it down to this very vanilla version of things. And that's not really who the world is, who we are as a people, who we are living in 2019, with sort of the way this country's run and the way it was previously run and our voices to sort of stand up for who we are. That's what's important now. And advertising essentially should be leading that march, but really it's mirroring it, which is a very interesting time. It's never been that way.
Right. Emil, you've been pushing boundaries in a lot of the rooms that you've been in for a long time. Talk to us about the personal courage that it takes at times to kind of say, hey, this is the way it needs to be.
So this film really speaks to me because I was raised by two black lawyers. And my mom actually went to law school first in the early 60s when she was pregnant with my older brother. And so I think about the courage of, the early 60s, a black woman who's pregnant going to law school. And what does that look like? And what does she face? What kind of patriarchy does she face? What kind of hypermasculinity does she face? And what kind of racism? And so my parents were very bold, and they always taught me and my brother and I that we were enough. And so, but it was also our responsibility that when we went into rooms that we showed up as our full selves and that we represented ourselves and we always spoke up, not just for ourselves, but for our community. And so that is how I was raised. So when I am, the first black gay editor of a national magazine, and I'm editor-in-chief of Vibe during the heyday of the misogynistic hip-hop era, it was tough. It's kind of like as I'm listening to DeRay say white supremacy in this room, you have that moment where you're like, you gotta do it, you gotta say it, you gotta push forward. And so I just pushed, and I wanted the hip-hop community, I wanted women to be seen. I wanted the LGBTQI+ community to be seen because we're part of that community. And it was uncomfortable, and there were a few times where I had to step to the record labels and say, hey, just left this album listening, and there's some really homophobic, misogynistic, horrible lyrics. And so if you want to put that out, that's cool. I will not cover it, period, point blank. So I think it's part of, when we're in those rooms, we have to speak up too, and it's uncomfortable. But in that discomfort, we're moving things forward. It was a big deal with the advertising community that I was gay when I was at Vibe because no one was ready for that. And they're like, no, this is hip hop, and most of our audience are women, and you're putting all this gay stuff in the magazine. But little did I know that I was, informing and inspiring all these young men around the world who were looking at television and seeing me and seeing oh, well, I can be him. I can be an executive. I can be a black gay man who's proud and on television. I wasn't thinking that in my seat, but I'm so glad that I provided that opportunity.
I think that is so true. Damon, I think just to piggyback that, I think that is one of the things that we take for granted. Having a conversation around leadership and being comfortable leading. I saw an earlier panel where they just talked about warm seats or just warming the seat. And it's no, if you get to that stage, you get in the room, that's an opportunity. And every time you're in that room, you should be an advocate for what you believe in and what your community believes in. That doesn't mean that you just stay in those lanes, but it is really important. I remember coming into the industry and being told that a black man couldn't be the face of an agency. It was crazy, and I think back to it, and I know that for a long time it fueled me to be well, no, I'm gonna prove this woman wrong. I'm gonna show her that every time I'm gonna lead and step up into a role that I can be in. So I think just knowing when you are in those rooms, being an advocate for what you believe in versus just participating is really critical. And I think, as you talked about, Emil, I think it's like you have to do that on a consistent basis because it gets easier. Like the first time you do it, it's gonna feel real rough. It's gonna feel like, I don't know if I like that. But you do it a couple times and all of a sudden you're like, no, I'm ready. Like all of a sudden you start getting to the edge of the seat, ready to have that conversation. So I think just making sure that you are leading in a way that that you're representing the community in a way that feels strong and empowering.
I just want to add, because I was working with Emil a lot at that time, and I really commended you then, but I want to do it now again and remind people, because I don't, even the way you say it, it was a tumultuous time, and hip hop in general was so sort of like ultra masculine and aggressive, and it was, we're talking about 1998, it was DMX, it was Jay-Z, it was R. Kelly, it was the Locks, and I remember you and I having a conversation about, well, what's going to happen when you do that cover shoot and somebody has to change? Do you have to leave the room? Do they, because what we do is we're in each other's business a lot, and it was a big deal. And I remember how strong you were about it, and I remember how you just held the line in a world where you were really out on your own. You really were, and it was you changed the course in that world for a lot of people. You really did, and I said it on the phone the other day, and I will say it anytime. I was right there. It was incredible.
DeRay, you're not shy about calling people out when they don't get it right. What have you learned about the conversation that people need to have? Because obviously you have people that have different points of view, different lived experiences, and there will be people who will look at the look or look at any ad from different lenses. How can we have these conversations in a way that brings people in, helps them learn more about culture and people different than themselves, that turns it constructive as opposed to people shutting down and not wanting to do anything at all?
Yeah, I push a little bit and say that I don't even know if it's like calling out as much as it's being honest. It's like, that was racist, right? I don't think that's like I'm not calling you out like that was racist, like that was homophobic, like that was, I was at ConferenceCon Chicago, and this guy came up to me and was talking about something like this. Somebody had a homophobic statement on Instagram, and he was like, but I don't think it was homophobic. And I'm like, I don't want to do this at ConferenceCon, but I can't let you walk away thinking that wasn't homophobic. That was homophobic, right? And it's like, I don't think that's like calling out. I think that part of what we have to do is like normalize telling the truth. And I think that part of it is like, we're so used to like, I think that part of the way that we have survived, so I don't blame us, I think that part of the way that we have survived is by like wrapping things a million times so that people will receive it at points. But like sometimes it's like, no, that was problematic, and so I think that's part of it. I believe too that, Karrelle and I were just talking about this idea that whoever owns the language owns the story, and whoever owns the story owns the lesson, right? And as organizers, we're always mindful that the first act is always the act of definition, that what is a border but a definition, right? That the act of definition is the first act of power. So when we hear people talk about diversity and inclusion, we're reminded that diversity is about bodies, inclusion is about culture. You can hire 20 more black people and still be a racist company. You can recruit 40 more trans members of the community and still be transphobic, right? That like people have done a lot of body work, very little culture work. We even think about things like punishment and consequence, right? When we talk about prisons and jails, we're reminded that punishment is about pain, consequence is about change. Locking a kid in a closet, I used to be a teacher and I would have to send kids to the guidance office. That is a consequence. If I lock you in a closet, that is about pain, that's punishment, right? And the language actually really matters. People use justice and accountability interchangeably, and we always remind people that they are similar but not the same. Accountability is what happens after the trauma. Justice is the idea that people shouldn't experience the trauma in the first place, right? Similar but not the same, and those stories actually really matter with how people think about it. My challenge to all of you, the storytellers, would be two final things. One is that like you actually give permission to people to think about the world deeper. So I was just asking Karrelle backstage, is that like when you've heard that the police, I have to have a plug about how awful the police are at most points, so this is my plug, is that when you hear the police say that they've solved a case, most people think that that means like they've arrested somebody, the person got convicted, Any stat for solving a case or a crime in America literally means at least one arrest was made. That is it. That is wild, you know? When we ask people, like, what % of all arrests that happen in the country are for violent crime, only 5% of the arrests that happen in America are for violent crime. Most people think that it's a lot. And when I say the police are wild, it's like a third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is actually killed by a police officer. And I say all that to say that, like, it is storytellers who help, like, get those messages out. And I'm always mindful that I'm talking to my aunt. My Aunt Mink is my audience. Because if Aunt Mink gets it, everybody, like, and not because Aunt Mink is stupid, because Aunt Mink is not stupid, but she is not watching CNN all day, right? So when Kavanaugh was happening, I wasn't saying Aunt Mink, Roe v. Wade is under siege. I'm like, Aunt Mink, they hiding the papers. There were some papers when he was in the White House, and they hiding the papers. And she was like, they hiding them? I'm like, girl, there were some papers. We don't know where the papers at. And I got her there, and then I was like, and he don't believe in a woman's right to choose. She was like, he don't. I'm like, girl, they hiding the papers, and he don't believe this fact. She was like, who do I call? I'm like, make that call, I mean, you know? But you do that, you know? Like, you teach us that that is possible.
I don't know how to follow up that. Where do I go from there?
DeRay.
Anthony, let's talk about some of the stories that you've been involved in telling. You've got a film coming up. Talk to us about the importance of getting that narrative out in a way that's stories that are not normally told.
Well, I have a film coming out called All Rise on November 15th, based on the book Monster, Walter D. Myers, and it's you know, it's an important story because it's about the trial of a 17-year-old kid from Harlem who gets accused of being part of a crime. And the movie sort of takes the process of the court system and how we accuse people, arrest people, try people, and sentence people, and sort of breaks it down and undoes it and sort of tells it backwards. And it deals a lot with sort of how we see scenarios and what is truth and what is not, right? And sometimes, you know, your life can be defined in 20 seconds. And that sort of taking that seed and making a film about it is really, you know, the heart of it. And for me, again, it was about nuance. It was about really exploring something from an honest perspective, almost from a gray perspective. Because we do black or white so well, right? We either do 5-hour documentary and that's supposed to be the truth, or we do 60-minute on TV and that's sort of like a drama, but we know that story has sort of been condensed into 60 minutes and that's why it has an arc in it. And for me, it was like, well, how do we slow everything down and sort of walk people through the steps of how this can happen? How can a good kid who goes to a good school with great parents end up being tried next to, you know, society's worst and looked at in the same lens because of color of skin, right? And how do you take that and really put a lens on it and unravel it? And so I was very honored to work with Jeffrey Wright and Jennifer Hudson and A$AP Rocky, who unfortunately just went through a similar scenario that reflects a lot to the movie, and an amazing actor named Kelvin Harrison Jr., who some of you might already know. And it was a deep responsibility of bringing the story to light. You know, I'm very honored.
What stories are you guys excited about seeing right now? I mean, we talked about how black men are portrayed in the media, and men of color being portrayed. Are there brands, and we're very quick to talk about brands that are getting it wrong. Are there brands that are getting it right that you would want to drive some awareness of?
So I thought about this really carefully, and I mean, I love, you know, I see a lot of work around women that's very powerful, and I think about like what Dove has done and different brands, and I think it's so powerful. And I was trying to think like, okay, from my lens, like black gay men, and I was doing this search, and there was a fashion ad that came out for Acne Studios in 2017, and it shows these black gay fathers with their kids, and they have like, I think 4 kids. And it's so, to DeRay's point, joyous. Like the kids are dancing on the bed, the dads are like laid in the bed, but they're all dressed in these really cool clothes. And it just was so normalized. But it was joyous. It wasn't like, oh, look at the black gay men with the daughters and they gotta do the hair, which is how they first went viral. But like, it was just cool. And I love that. And I think that that's important, that we don't just show the kind of, oh, we're broken, we're wounded, we're, you know, behind bars, we're sick, we're all these things. No, we are full of life and we're resilient and we're powerful, and let's show that.
You know, why is that a story that's hard to tell? Because you don't see a lot of that, right? I mean, we see a lot of film and advertising that builds empathy. for women in particular, but we don't see that for men in general, and it's rare that you see that for men of color. Any thoughts on why it's hard for people to tell stories that really show empathy?
I think it's in part because the historical narrative around the black man is that there is no weakness. Like I think that's why you don't see, it's like you don't see the edges of it, because by its nature, it's like you're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to be this thing. Like you're supposed to represent in a particular way. And I think we're finally, through the democratization of media, we're finally being able to tell various stories. And I think we're at that early stage of that journey right now. But I think that's what's happened, which is, it was like, the world wants to see black men a specific way. And that's how it is. It's kind of like, and again, I think it's incredible when we had Michelle and Barack in office, because again, black women were seen a particular way until Michelle is doing what she's doing and having those conversations. So it's like the challenge that we were faced with, I think, is that the reality of it is like people want to see us a particular way, and until we have enough storytellers, enough people owning the language to broaden that spectrum, it's still going to tell you the same way. I mean, we have the challenge when you asked that question. I was like shit, where are these stories? And I think that's something that we have to go back and look at, because it just doesn't, I don't feel like it exists on a consistent manner at all.
And I think about, what was really revolutionary was when Tyson Beckford was in the Ralph Lauren campaign, because I thought that was so bold, and that was a lot of the work that Beth Ann Hardison did behind the scenes, but to take this very kind of waspy brand created by a Jewish man, but to take that and show this very powerful, dark-skinned brother who just looked aspirational and beautiful and healthy and whole was powerful. And I still think, I was thinking about this question before the panel, and I still go back to that moment, because there was just something about that made me feel like I can do this.
I would say a couple things. One is sort of, the preface to this is that we think about whiteness not as the standard, but as a reminder of the myth, right? That so that is the preface. But I say that to say that when I think about one of the reasons for pushing on what has been said, that we don't see black men being seen as complex beings, is that one of the key parts of the myths is that there's only a certain set of people who get to be human, like fully human. And what we know to be true is that human means that I get to be poor and broke and damaged and happy and joyous and fun, and like all of those things, right? The lack of humanity says that I only get to be one at a time. And that what we want to remind people is that it's not fair to live in a world where we prop up the myth, because the myth says that again, I can be lost at sea every year, and that is okay, right? Or that I need to travel the world to find myself, or that I eat, pray, love my way to a new spirituality, right? But the reality is that we had to sleep on the floor when the gunshots got too close, and we went outside and played, and we went on vacations on the weekends that weren't really vacations because we were still in Baltimore, but it was, but that is what it means to be human, and I think that, and the second is I want to piggyback. You said something earlier about a seat at the table, and they said at the earlier panel, is that I'm always reminded that the seat at the table only exists because people sacrificed. Nobody is making seats for us because of the goodness of their heart. It only comes because somebody fought, struggled, or gave up, right? So when you sit in the seat and don't bring the spirit of the fight, the struggle, or the give up, you let us down. That's it. That is that is sort of the spirit. And yeah, I think that is it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the build that I would have on that, though, is it's also, there's a notion that sometimes doing stuff and featuring black men in advertising is not anything other than good business. And we know, we've done the research, that when you show black men normalized in family situations, that outperforms other advertising from the general market, right?
Because we drive everything black. There's no America without black, that is it,
So it's good business more than anything else.
Just to build on that, I was saying earlier when we had our call, something I'm really proud of is Rihanna right now and what she's done with Fenty. And that industry is, if anybody in here worked in beauty, it's one of the hardest industries, because literally they're trying to figure out, okay, what is the perfect version of every face? How do we capture every market in one commercial with the perfect version of every face? And I think that classically the Naomi's and the Alex, that sort of like version of that face, Rihanna took that and just turned it inside out and said, what feels real? What feels authentic? What feels like the girls that I hang out with, my fans? How do I make this incredibly inclusive? And beauty was never inclusive. In a way, it was exclusive because it was about showing you either perfection or something that is just gorgeous and bold, and she's turned that industry upside down. Actually, the advertising model of that industry is completely, in chaos because nobody can understand how she did this. And really what she did was she just made it real. And that's coming from somebody that, I go back, I'd say 12 years since she was 16. We did 18 videos together. So I've watched her sort of take control and take command of not just her music and her team and her messaging, but now this global market. And the fact that she, as somebody that was never in the beauty industry, in 18 months can come in and be this disruptive and build it into a billion-dollar business is remarkable. And that's a reflection of the work. And also, to be fair, this campaign, you could never come to me and say that P&G would do something like this with no product in it. No product. So you're not promoting anything, you're trying to re-message. And to spend time and energy and resources against that, when classically brands are, you walk into a soundstage and it's the same commercial, but there's the Latin cast, there's the white cast, and there's the AA cast, and we're doing the same commercial with three different, now bring the Latin family, okay, now bring the white family in. Great, okay, now let's do this, and you're literally cutting different spots, and sort of like, how did we get there, right? Why can't we come up with ways to speak to people without having to segment people, right? And so to do this is incredibly bold, and you have a lot to be proud of.
Thank you.
It's rare.
We say in the office, there's a little thing over the photocopy. If you talk to people the way advertising talk to people, they'll punch you in the face. Yeah. Right? And I think that's what Anthony's saying is like, be real about the message that you have to say.
Yeah.
And I think that's what that did in a really powerful way.
Yeah. Well, it's time and place. I mean, part of what we're trying to do is to elevate that conversation, right? Because if we don't talk about it, we can't deal with it. And to do it in a way that brings lots of people to the table, because they're not at the table today. So we've got to do that. Before we wrap up, one final piece or word of advice for our audience as they take away a challenge of telling authentic stories that represent all people, black men included, accurately and positively. What would be one word of advice you would have for them as storytellers?
Tell your story. Like, start by telling your story. You've got channels to do it. Like, tell your story first. Like, get comfortable with that. Then you can advocate for other stories in other rooms. But I would just start with that. Like, that would be me.
Anthony?
Take the self-censoring away. It's a similar message. But I think, we try to craft towards a box. And I think what we're seeing now is we're sort of taking that mentality away and just crafting towards what is real and authentic. And we as a culture of social media and Instagram and of telling these stories is changing the actual model of how we advertise. It's really a fascinating time. And the more we do that, we can create this lasting and actually make this change forever versus just being a moment in time. That's what I hope with this. So.
Great, thank you. DeRay?
So I haven't talked about being a gay black man, so I'll say 3 quick things about that. One is that gay people have always been here, so like just because more visible doesn't mean new, right? The second is this reminder that my identity is not an icebreaker. So the more and more that people introduce like, hey, this is so-and-so, my gay, and you're like, no, not an icebreaker, right? That like who I am is not an icebreaker. The third is really this reminder that people have value beyond love. So there is something really beautiful about talking about marriage equality that is important, but people who are queer are important not only because they have the right to marry, right? That like, how do we start to remind people that the value that people bring is not about their relationships with other people or their relationships with the state, that people inherently are valuable, and that is a message that we often, even good-hearted people, screw up around identity.
Mine's very simple. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Great. I guess I'll throw one of my own in is deliberately look for who's not in the room. in order to tell the story. Even as the team that's here that worked on the look, there were times we looked around and there was only black people in the room, and we knew we had to bring in different perspectives. So we have to be deliberate, if that's a political leaning, if that's race, if that's gender, if that's identity, whatever it is, but look at your teams and deliberately say who's not in this room, and then go get those voices and help them tell your stories. So with that, Karrelle, Anthony, DeRay, Emil, thank you very much for your time. I'm gonna head it out.
Thank you to our panelists. That was amazing. You guys were amazing. So it's time to break for lunch in the Diamond Foyer. And so this is a networking lunch. And so what I want you to do is to introduce yourself to 3 people, at least 3 people that you have never met before, okay? And by networking, we mean building positive, powerful relationships. So this is the beginning of a new relationship. How about that? And I'm checking all of your posts on ADCOLOR on the app and seeing all of your powerful responses, so that's really good. I want to make sure that you keep them coming. I remember the first year that I hosted the conference, we were trending. Can we trend again, please? Can we get us trending? And make sure that you keep track of all of your schedules and network with each other on the app as well. And after lunch, you'll head to your breakout sessions. Every single breakout session is a winner. All of them are dynamic, so just go, participate, be there, be present, and we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock for the afternoon panels that focus on the voices of the Latinx community. Yes, okay, that's okay, thank you. The state of women in color in the workplace, so I'm really excited about that. Thank you all for your presence, for your energy, for your enthusiasm. Have a great lunch. Hit me up on social at Tybo, and we will see you later, okay? Thank you.